Hi, everybody. This is Brittany. I'm with Tidemark TV, and I'm here with Keshia Grant, and she is the owner and therapist of Mindfully Restored Counseling. And what we're talking about today is just how counseling looks different for folks who are minorities in the counseling room and what unique issues they present with. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yes, I'm Keshia, Mindfully Restored Counseling. I've been in mental health field, psychiatric hospital settings, outpatient settings for, since 2010. But I just started my own private practice in August of 2018. So,
what made you want to go the private practice route?
I loved the inpatient setting. I loved helping people in their crisis situations, but after seeing so much of it, to me, there had to be something that could be done on the preventative end. Like, how do I help people before they get to this part? And even after that, I wanted to be able to help facilitate that ongoing treatment afterwards.
Yeah, because not a lot of people have like hospitalization-like settings where they've worked before. And so that tends to scare off a lot of counselors when you get presented with some pretty big issues. So the fact that folks have you as a resource is really huge.
Yes, I loved it in the hospital setting. Adult psychiatric hospitals, adolescent psychiatric hospitals, inpatient, ER, I loved it.
What drew you to counseling initially, if you don't mind me asking?
The original goal was to be a doctor, but I don't like science. But no, just really the way people think and how they interact and the choices they make, whether consciously or subconsciously that they know about it, and how it influences them, and then also culture, what their culture does for them, what it means to them, how that influences their decision making and thought processes and their daily activity. I wanted to get to see the inner workings of that and help people through the stresses of that.
That makes perfect sense. So tell me a little bit, are there any particular specialties that you work with within your practice that you have?
Yes, so I work primarily with women, minority women specifically, anywhere from the ages early 20s to late 40s. That's the main age range. But here lately, I've been seeing mostly of the mid-20, early 30-year-olds, emerging adulthood, or late millennials. That age range. But I love helping specifically women.
Perfect. And so, one of the things that I've been in private practice for about 5 or 6 years myself, and one of the things that I've run across is not a lot of minorities tend to access counseling services. And I imagine that some of that is a financial burden, but I also imagine a lot of that is just stigma associated with counseling, as well as just fear of what counseling is going to be like. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit as to what the counseling process looks like in the therapy room with minorities.
It, even just on for myself, like seeing when I have clients that come in for their first time coming into therapy, they'll say, I don't know what this is supposed to look like. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. Like, what do you want? And so just kind of start real slow. Stigma around it, community-wise, access and availability, what's available to them in wherever they are. And the financial concern side of it does have a lot to do with it as well, too.
And so I imagine, because I grew up in poverty, right? And I know that a lot of minority folks do as well, just because they don't have the same resources as far as being able to obtain education or be able to obtain better jobs that they might be able to get. And so they're kind of stuck in service industry jobs a lot. And so I'm a little bit curious, because when I was in poverty, there was a lot of you're just focusing on trying to put food on the table, keep a roof over your head, just build survival type of stuff. And so I wonder, does that need for survival impact the counseling relationship within the therapy room at all?
It can. It absolutely can. Sometimes the need for survival, it weighs heavy on the individual, on the client coming in, that they don't know or they don't feel like they're even able to unpack what all that they have experienced. Like, how can I trust you to handle what I've gone through and be able to help me process that when I don't even know if I'm able to like face it all myself? Like, what does that look like? And then also, who has time to unpack all of that? Like, I don't want to relive everything that I've already been through. Like, in their mind, I've already dealt with it. Like, that's in the past. That's made me who I am, and I've dealt with it. I need to work on what's going on right now. And so trying to get them to see how certain things have played out in their lives and the decisions that they have made, even in the past, have affected where they are today.
Could you go ahead? Sorry.
It's interconnected. And so trying to balance that out, help them balance.
And so one of the questions one of the things that you said was that people say, oh, that's in the past, I've dealt with that, that's over. Could you speak a little bit to how just like leaving it in the past and dealing with it doesn't just mean that that's like a closed door and you're never going to have to like talk about it again, or it doesn't still affect you in your day-to-day life?
Yes. So one thing, especially I know for sure in like Black communities and Black families, African Americans, it's, what happens in this house, it stays in this house, so you don't talk about things that have happened in your childhood upbringing or things that happen at home. You may talk about it amongst your family, but you don't talk about it outside of that house setting. And that translates into growing up over the years. Like, well, we didn't get to talk about that. Like, that wasn't an issue for us. Everybody knew that, we had a cousin that was kind of touched or kind of special, but we never talked about it. We never dealt with that. Meanwhile, that person has had years of trauma that they haven't been able to talk about to anyone, and they don't see how that has affected them in their adult life and going forward.
And so if somebody were to think about coming to therapy for the first time, where maybe they only talked about it with family members, or maybe even the family didn't even want to talk about it because it was just too difficult of a topic or whatever, what sort of advice or words of wisdom would you give to them if they were seeking out therapy for the first time?
I like to let my clients know that therapy, for the first time and even ongoing, is kind of like cleaning out a wound. It's going to be extremely tender, extremely painful, because we're ripping off the scar and cleaning out all that infection that's inside that wound. And it's going to take time for it to heal properly. So I expect you to be guarded with me on certain things. I'm never going to push you too far, but I will challenge you, to exercise that wound so we can get to what's under the bottom of it and make sure it heals properly. So kind of giving them, speaking to them in terms that they can relate to on an everyday level, like making sense of it for them, not dumbing it down, but also just making it more personable. Like, I'm going to take this slow with you, but as long as you're willing to do the work and willing to do the exercises and cleaning out the wound with me, this will be okay. We can get through this together.
And you had mentioned something before, like, I'm not going to push you too hard or something like that. And I know that speaks a lot into trust. And one of the things that I do want to point out to anybody that's listening is, us as therapists, we don't expect you to trust us like on day one as soon as you meet us, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I'm wondering, could you speak a little bit more to how folks who are minorities and coming into counseling, how we help build up that trust level?
Yes, kind of just taking it, letting them know, like I let my clients know, I only look good on certain days. Like I'm a person just like you're a person. I take this serious. I'm willing to do the work, but if there's something I don't have the answer to, I will absolutely say I don't have the answer to. If there's something that is like very impactful and even traumatic that you have shared with me, like I will feel empathy for you in that moment and let you know, like, that's a lot, that hurts. Like, I'm sorry you had to hold on to that for so long. Another thing that I like to do personally in my counseling sessions is when whenever someone comes in, I ask them, you know, to get them connected more so than just, how are you doing today? I will ask them, you know, well, how's your spirit and how's your heart? Like, to get that personal level, to actually make them think and like, well, she's really concerned about how I'm actually doing, and how am I doing? Like, what does that feel like?
Mm-hmm. Right. It goes just beyond the questions of like, what's the weather like? Hey, how are you doing? In that obligatory, yeah, everything's good response.
Right. Because if everything is good, like, why are you here?
Mm-hmm. Right. And so in your experience, what are some of the other like common struggles that folks who are minorities tend to face, like just common issues that they might come in with?
Their family support. A lot of times, especially given the generational divide and how that has happened, or how life has happened, the family support of them going to therapy. I get a lot of first-time clients that no one knows they're in therapy except for maybe a best friend, and that's someone that's of the same age and, you know, status or peer group as them, which is fine. But I always ask them in my assessment, I was like, well, who is someone, or who are the people that support you? And not just financially, not just, you know, like in an intimate relationship. Who are people that support you emotionally? What does that look like? And I let them tell me if it's their family or not. Like, I don't assume or anything, but that's one of the biggest things that I see. A lot of family support, or people, you know, families will tell them kind of jokingly, like, maybe you should talk to somebody, like, I can't help you, like, and just be real dismissive of them. And that can be hurtful to someone who's already struggling and coming into knowing they need to come into counseling, but looking for that support. Like, I don't know where to get that. Mm-hmm. So how do I trust a stranger if my family won't even support me?
Right. They've known me my whole entire life and they can't even handle this. How's a stranger going to be able to do that?
Exactly.
Mm-hmm. And so you said that they don't have a whole lot of support. And I wonder, does that translate into like financial support or transportation support at all?
It can. At different times it can, especially for those who are starting new jobs or unsure of what that looks like, as far as, you know, when I do my intake calls or like consultation calls, you know, of course, one of the questions is, well, how much are your rates? You know, what do you charge? What does that look like? Sliding scale. And I always tell whoever I'm talking to, I was like, whether it's me or if you're doing, you know, calling any other therapist, ask them about their sliding scale. Ask them if that's even an option. You know, let them know your situation. Don't be afraid or think that the therapy will change, that the counselor's approach to therapy with you will change because you're asking for that. Our goal is to help you. We understand that certain things are tight. So it's one of those things that you have to be willing to ask for that support and what that looks like. And maybe there can be a compromise along the way.
And yes, absolutely. And to shift gears a little bit, I would imagine that folks who are minorities are coming in with a lot of the same, at least like on the surface, same issues like depression, anxiety, trauma. And I know that that might look a little bit different for everybody given their life experiences, but I really do want to like normalize and let folks know you're not the only person that's struggling with this. Just because people aren't necessarily talking about it or talking about it in the open doesn't mean that it still doesn't happen.
Right. You're not absolutely the only person dealing with it, but I think it's the component of I have to keep it together. I have to be strong because my mom was able to keep it together. Her mom was able to do this. Like, why am I suffering? What makes me any different? Mm-hmm. Like, I come from and you'll hear people say that, minorities say that, I come from a long line of strong women in my family or strong people in my family. We don't cry out loud. We don't cry in public, you know. Tears are a sign of weakness. And one of the questions I asked also in my assessment, I was like, well, what is your definition of vulnerability? What does it mean to you to be vulnerable? And there are a lot of people that can't answer that. Like, they don't have a definition for it or a proper term for that, for how it fits even into their lives. And it makes them really think, like, I've never thought about that before. Because they've internalized the concept that vulnerable means weakness.
Mm-hmm. And so if it doesn't mean weakness, what is an alternative like definition for vulnerability?
I like to think of vulnerability as the ability to be transparent and open and honest with someone else. Despite whatever is sitting in front of you, you can be open and honest with them.
And actually, I think to be that vulnerable, that is actually, it's the opposite of weakness, right? It takes a lot of courage and it takes a lot of strength to be that open and honest with somebody, because you have a fear of people using that information or whatever against you, or judging you for it, or rejecting you for it. And so that's why it's one of the hardest things that we can do, but also one of the most rewarding things as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah. And so I'm kind of curious, are there other issues just off the top of your head that minorities tend to come in with that is unique specifically to minorities?
I wouldn't say necessarily unique to them, but it presents differently. So I have a lot of my clients will talk a lot about the intergenerational traumas, that lineage of things that they have carried because of family history. And they're like realizing now, like, oh, I didn't realize that's why I interact with my siblings the way they do, because the way our parents raised us, you know, or you feel like you're the black sheep of the family when you were literally the only one that could actually see what was going on. But because everybody else was so dysfunctional in the family, you know, they kind of convinced you that you weren't. So it's not necessarily unique to them. It just kind of presents differently and getting them to understand that or vocalize that in a way that's more apparent. Now it feels unique. It does feel unique in the sense, you know, relationships are relationships, but that whole, how do I establish and maintain a healthy relationship with adults? How do I decide for my own self what spirituality looks like for me versus what it looked like for my parents? Like, how do I separate from my parents' view of what they wanted for my life and still make them proud, but do what I want to do? So it feels unique, but it's not necessarily anything different.
One of the things that I've noticed is specifically like in my work with minorities, and I'm hoping that maybe you could speak a little bit more on this, when you touched on intergenerational trauma, one of the things that I've noticed is there's trauma like from their great-grandparents' generation or from their grandparents' generation and then from their parents' generation. And that trauma tends to affect their relationships and how folks tend to raise children, right? And so you get raised in like stricter homes where you don't get to speak a lot, and you also don't get to really experience emotions a lot.
Exactly. So even from just an age range standpoint, my grandparents were born in the 40s. So in their generation as adults, you know, they were verbal and expressive, but it was very dysfunctional in how they interacted with each other when it came to arguing and conflict. So my parents' generation, born in the 60s, as they grew up and saw how their parents interacted, their thought was, I'm not going to raise my family that way. We're going to be different. We're not going to argue in public. We're not going to be as, you know, detrimental to each other in front of the kids. Like, I'm not going to raise my kids that way. The thought that happens is a good thought, but the action that takes place, it goes to the complete opposite extreme. So now you have kids that don't know how to interact. They never see conflict. Like, you see the parents grow up, well, you never see them argue in front of you, which is an okay thing, but you never see them resolve conflict. Kids can pick up on tension. You know when there's tension in the house. You know when there's tension between people. But how do you resolve that? And so now I'm seeing that generation of kids that are now adults. The millennials are like, well, how do I resolve conflict? How do I appropriately disagree with someone and make that okay? How can I have agency over my own self and take up space and feel okay about taking up that space? Because that intergenerational trauma has carried from literally generation to generation to where I am today. And that's, you know, the conflict part of it, the arguing, that's a simplified version of it. But you can relate that to any type of trauma, what that looks like as far as relationships, as far as even for substance abuse, you can translate that down further. So it's a big thing.
Yeah. And what you described, like, I don't know that there's a term for it, but I like to try to call it the yo-yo effect, where we start off with one really big extreme, right? And then the next generation goes, you know what? I want the complete opposite of that. And so then the next generation is like, well, I'm going to be the complete opposite of that. And it just keeps going back and forth and back and forth. And I always tell folks, that balance is really the key for all of this. You've got to find out what that happy medium looks like for you.
Mm-hmm. I like to think of it as literally as harmony, because a big thing in minority communities or minority families is raising families within an actual community. You're going to have what is the word? I just completely drew a blank. But you're going to have advice given to you from different people, whether you unsolicited advice from people, whether you ask for it or not, because of that whole concept. Well, we're raising this child together in a community. But even with that, eat the meat, spit out the bones, pick what works for you. You don't have to take everything, but be able to harmonize it together to what it will look like and what will be appropriate and healthy for you and your family.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's just a beautiful concept. I love that. And so I'm kind of curious, like, we've touched on a lot of different topics in here, and I'm wondering, is there anything off the top of your head that we haven't touched on that you feel needs to have words to it, or, just to be addressed in general?
I think I would like to let the listeners know, especially for minorities, that it's okay to cry. I think a lot of times, even with that, like, we feel, well, not we, but it can be perceived as, I can't cry in public because they're going to think that I'm weak. Or I can't cry in public because I don't know how to, once I start, I don't know how to stop, And sometimes that's okay too. Like, you have to let that out. Mm-hmm. Holding on to that much stress in your body is not healthy either. Internalizing that completely is not healthy. You have to be able to let that out. And so I like to give my clients that opportunity. Like, if I see them on the verge of tears, and you've seen it before in session, like, and they'll like take a deep breath and stop talking and like kind of just, mm-hmm. I'm just like, okay, take a breath. And I tell them I'm okay with silence. Like, if you need this moment to process whatever you're feeling emotionally, we can sit in that for a moment. I'll sit with you in that. That's absolutely fine. Like, you have to be able to have that expression of that emotion to be able to heal properly. Mm-hmm. And I think that's big for women as well as men, minority men too.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. And no matter what you come in with, whether it's like tears of anger, whether it's tears of sadness, all of that is really acceptable. It's just a matter of what you said. It's really important to just get it out, because when we internalize that leads to heart attacks, that leads to high cholesterol, that leads to diabetes, that leads to stress eating. It just really affects us so much.
Yes. Another thing that I see a lot of minorities, and I thought about this as you were asking me, is there something specific or unique to minorities when they come into counseling? A lot of minorities deal, especially women, I guess maybe because that's mostly what I see, the microaggressions, mm-hmm. and how that plays a huge impact on their daily activities and daily like living functions or mm-hmm. stresses of life. When you constantly let those microaggressions build up, like, it can feel very overwhelming once you get to a level of, okay, I can't take any of this anymore. Mm-hmm. It's never just one microaggression that sets you off. It's if you unpack it all, have been countless or multiple that have been placed upon you, and then now you're just like, what's happening? How did I lose control? How did people feel like they can do this to me and take advantage of me? It feels very dismissive and, belittling.
Mm-hmm. And so for folks out there who might not be familiar with the term microaggression, like, what does that look like? Like, could you give some examples?
Yes. So microaggressions are those small, intangible, even sometimes tangible things that are seen as jokingly, but can still be offensive and inappropriate or uncomfortable to the person that they're inflicted upon. So an example would be, telling a minority woman or African American woman, like, "Oh, your hair is nice. Can I touch it?" Mm-hmm. Don't, like, why? We don't, and the thought is literally, no, don't touch my hair. I'm not a pet. Don't pet my hair. So while it's intended as a compliment, but why would you need to touch it to see it and give a compliment? You know?
Absolutely. And so what I tell people as a rule is, if you're not willing to do that with every single person out there, then it's probably inappropriate on some level, right?
Exactly. Yes.
And so just out of curiosity, like if folks wanted to particularly work with you, how could they find you?
You can find me on my website at mindfullyrestoredcounseling.com. Or you can send me an email at lakgrant, LAKGRANT at mindfullyrestored.com. And I also have an Instagram page, business Instagram page at mindfully_restored on Instagram. I'm still working on my Facebook page. That is a different monster to create.
Wonderful. And just before we wrap up here, is there anything else that you would like to add to our discussion today?
I think that everyone should have the opportunity to go to therapy, to try it at least once, even if it's just for the intake session. I would prefer that you go at least 2 or 3 times, but it's the same thing. You go to the dentist twice a year for preventative measures and checkups. Your therapist can be the same thing. It doesn't have to be extreme cases that you go to therapy for.
Yeah. And I also want folks to know, too, to add on to what you just said, sometimes when you try out a therapist, you just don't mesh well with them the first go around. It is okay to shop around for different therapists. Just because you didn't have a good success with the first one doesn't mean that you're like a lost cause or anything like that. You just got to find somebody that really is your spirit animal, for lack of a better word.
Exactly. And even as a therapist in the session, like, does this sound like something that you'll be able to handle? Like, yeah.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Keshia, for all of your insight that you've added. And I look forward to just like talking to you in the future. And please like stay in touch with me and let me know how your practice is doing.
I will. I absolutely will. I was looking as I was sitting down recording. I was like, oh, I'm on the wall that's bare. Like that's so behind me you don't see anything, just a blank wall. But yes, I will let you know how it goes and hopefully how it grows. And I thank you for this opportunity to speak with you.
Yeah, thanks so much.